So a question I often get asked is, how did you actually start your web design agency? Well, the answer I usually give is there's a bit of a story to it. But I always find that hearing other people's stories is one of the best ways to gain indirect experience. So in this video, I'm going to share my complete journey and how I started my agency. Stick with me while I try and distill 20 plus years into under 10 minutes. Hi, thanks for joining. If you're new to this channel, I'm Rich Dean, a web designer and developer, former web agency owner, and author of the book series Start, Grow and Sell Your Web Design Agency. My goal is to help anyone looking to start, grow and sell an agency to save time, earn more money, avoid the mistakes and pitfalls, and build a thriving and valuable business. Okay, so let's get into it. Part 1. I started with a design education. So growing up as a kid and going to school, I always loved drawing, and art was always my favourite subject. When I was at primary school, I did loads of drawing, and when I went to secondary school, I got my first taste of drawing and design on a computer using CorelDRAW on the school's PCs, and at home I had a Commodore Amiga 500 Plus with Deluxe Paint 3, so pretty old school. That was back in the 80s and 90s, so that was pretty much the heyday of print-based graphic design. The internet had only just been invented, and so web design wasn't really a thing back then, but graphic design was quite a sought after career, so I knew even back then that I wanted to be a graphic designer. I did okay at secondary school. I got decent grades in my GCSEs, and art was my strongest subject, so I left secondary school and went to art college, studying art and graphic design. What might surprise you is that I never went to university or got a degree, and I think that's quite an important point to make. I think as a society, we've kind of got into the mindset that the only way to be successful is to go to university, but I don't personally think that's always the case. I left college when I was 19, and I did want to go to university, but I didn't have much money. So my original plan was to have a year out, see if I could get a job in graphic design and get some experience, and then maybe go to university the following year. But in the end, I didn't need to. Part 2, I landed a career in graphic design. So there's a lot of talk nowadays about how hard it is for young people to get on the career ladder and land their first job. But even when I was leaving education back in the early 2000s, it was really hard even back then. I remember finishing my college course and desperately wanting to get a job in graphic design, but there just weren't that many jobs being advertised. And all the ones that were being advertised wanted at least 2 years experience. So there was kind of this catch-22. You needed 2 years experience to get a job, but how do you get a job to get that experience in the first place? It was really frustrating. I remember writing to lots of companies and getting loads of rejections, but I kept trying, and in the end, I was fortunate enough to land my first role as a junior designer for a local print publication. It wasn't the most exciting role, but it didn't matter. I was on the career ladder, and I was getting paid for something that up to then had felt like a hobby to me. It was amazing. That first role also gave me invaluable skills and experience in the design industry, and I never actually ended up going to university. Instead, I worked really hard to develop my skills and experience as a designer, first in print-based graphic design, and then a couple of years later I moved over to web design and started building my expertise there. Part 3. I use my career time to understand founders and agencies. Okay, just before we get into this one, I need to ask you a really big favour. We're a fairly new channel, and so it would really help us a lot if you could like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and also share this content with anyone else you think could benefit from it. It takes a lot of time to make these videos, so this will really help YouTube to recognise our content, and it will mean we can carry on making helpful videos just like this. Okay, thank you, and back into it. So when I was growing up, I didn't really understand what businesses were. My parents weren't really from a business background. They always worked for other people, and they didn't really teach us about this at school either. I just thought that businesses were these kind of big fixed institutions, a bit like machines. I didn't really understand the human element behind them. So when I started working, I was actually really surprised to find out the stories behind the businesses that I worked for. During my career, I worked for several agencies, but I always remember the first one I worked for. It was only a small agency, but it was owned by these two guys who had both been designers themselves. They then decided that they wanted to go into business together and start their own design agency. I was kind of blown away by it. I didn't even realise you could do that, but it was such a pivotal moment, and looking back, it was probably one of the single most important contributors to me wanting to eventually start my own agency. That was quite early on, and I knew I wanted to build my career first and climb my way up the career ladder, but it also cemented in me this idea that one day I would eventually like to start my own agency. From then on, even though I carried on working as an employed designer for many years, for all the companies I worked for, I always took the time to get to know the founders and their stories. And I also used my time as a way to better understand the mechanics of design agencies and how they operate. I also used this time to understand the various roles within those agencies. So, as well as progressing my own role from junior to midweight to senior designer and then to head of design, I also gained a unique insight into all the other roles like developers, account managers, project managers, and so many more. That really helped me to understand how agencies worked. Part 4, I leverage my roles to develop broad skills. So, in the years that I worked as an employed designer, I also worked hard to develop my skills beyond just my own core of design. And it wasn't just because I wanted to start my own agency one day either. I just enjoyed learning new skills and being hands on. So, although I was designing websites, I also learned how to code and build them. That started back in the early days when everything was still table-based HTML layouts, but then I learned CSS, Flash, ActionScript, jQuery and JavaScript, and then eventually PHP and WordPress. I never viewed web design as a split between design and development. For me, it was all the same. They were just two sides of creating websites. To me, development is design, and so I had as much fun coming up with the UX and the visuals as I then did figuring out how to code and build it. This was long before AI, and because I worked in agencies and worked alongside some really talented developers, I knew I was sitting on a goldmine of information. So I never missed an opportunity to pick those developers' brains so I could find out how to do something, even if they probably did find me a bit annoying. For most of the time, this was just me wanting to learn new skills though. But then as I started to think more about starting my own agency, I started to realise that those skills would probably be really important. Part 5, I tested the water early. So in my books and in a couple of my other videos, I talk about the importance of testing the water early. For me, this came a few years before I started my agency properly. Even though I was working full-time as a designer, people would reach out to me asking me if I could design and build their websites. It was never a huge amount, just enough to give me some extra pocket money on top of my main job, but I took it as an opportunity to get some early experience of how to run my own business, what nowadays we'd probably call a side hustle. I treated it as a proper business and I even gave it its own logo and brand. I registered as self-employed with HMRC and started doing my own tax returns. I created templates for quotes and invoices that I used to send to clients. I started tracking my time so that I could better understand how long things took and so how I needed to quote for projects. And I kept detailed records of how much money my little side hustle was making. It wasn't very much, but it taught me some important lessons, and most importantly, it gave me the confidence to know that I could run my own business. Part 6, I planned the jump. It was still a few more years after I started my little side hustle before I decided I was definitely going to start my own agency. But once I'd made up my mind that it was something I was going to do, that was it. I knew there was no going back. But it was also a big life decision, and so I knew it would need some careful planning. I had a family and bills to pay, so I wanted to make sure that we had a good safety net. My first step was to find out how to actually set up a limited company. I was still working as a full-time designer, and although I already had my self-employed side hustle, I always knew I wanted to set my agency up as a proper business, in its own right, separate to me, so that it could grow and evolve into its own thing. I also wanted to make sure we had enough money in the bank to cover all our bills for at least 3 months, just in case the worst happened and I couldn't find any work. At least I'd have enough time to find another job if my new agency didn't work out. I also knew that I wanted to commit to my new business full time. I know plenty of people try to build new businesses gradually, alongside their full-time job until it's big enough that they can make the jump, but that wasn't how I wanted to do it. I'm quite a black and white person, and so to me, I was either going to be in or out. And so if I was in, I was going to be in properly, and that meant quitting my full-time job. In my mind, that was the only way I'd be able to commit to it properly and make it work. But I needed time to build that financial buffer, so I gave myself 6 months. Fortunately, at the same time I decided to do all this, I had a couple of nice freelance projects come through my side hustle. Looking back, it was complete serendipity, but those 2 projects gave me the money I needed for my safety buffer, and they also gave me a couple of nice projects to include as case studies for my new agency. Part 7, I made the hard switch. So after 6 months, and once those 2 freelance projects were finished, I took the leap and quit my full-time job. I'm not going to lie, it was one of the scariest things I've ever done. I had a well-paying job in a big top London agency, and I was going from that to working in my spare bedroom, wondering where I'd find the work. But I was determined to make it a success. The agency I worked for were really supportive, and I left on good terms, and they were even good enough to pass on one of their clients to me. Once I'd left, I committed to my new business full time. I rolled up my sleeves, worked hard, went out and networked and met lots of new people, and over the following months, I managed to get it off the ground and functioning as a proper business. And the rest, as they say, is history. Okay, so hopefully you found this video useful and it's given you some valuable insights into how you could start your agency. If you've enjoyed it, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like more tips and insights for how to grow your business, check out my book series Start, Grow and Sell Your Web Design Agency, which you can buy from Amazon now, and I'll share a link in the description below. And if you want even more insight into how to actually start an agency, be sure to check out this video here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.